Welcome to episode 3 of Rangam's Empathy Learns webinar series, The Legal and Ethical Imperatives of Disability Inclusion. Today, we'll explore the laws that guide disability inclusion and the ethical responsibility to create truly inclusive workplaces. Thanks for joining us, and let's get started. Hello, friends. Welcome to the third episode of Rangam's Empathy Learns webinar series titled Unlocking the Power of Disability Inclusion and Neurodiversity. Rangam is a global workforce solutions firm on a mission to accelerate meaningful employment for everyone. As a minority, woman, and disability-owned company, we've spent over 25 years promoting inclusive talent programs that create real impact in our communities and our workplaces. We've loved the work. If you're new to the Empathy Learns webinar series, I'm John Bryson, the Senior Director of Learning and Development and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Rangam. I'm also neurodivergent. I have ADHD. And I have over 18 years of experience advocating for inclusion. So I'm excited to talk about this important topic today, which if you did miss that webinar series, we've had 2 episodes so far. This is episode 3. We explored the competitive advantage of disability inclusion and broke down common myths about disability and neurodiversity already. So if you're interested and you missed those episodes, you can find the recordings on our YouTube channel, our website, and of course, in our webinar follow-up emails, we'll be putting links in there. So in this episode today, we're going to be discussing the legal and ethical imperatives of disability inclusion, why it's not just the right thing to do, though that's the main reason we should do things, but also it's a necessity for compliance and cultural transformation. So let's get into the foundation of disability inclusion when it comes to key laws. So understanding the laws that protect disabled individuals is really important. The world has changed very much in the last, 30 or 40 years for people with disabilities across the world. In the US, one of the most important laws, the one that affects me personally the most, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Many people refer to it as the ADA, signed in law in 1990. This serves as the cornerstone of the protections that people with disabilities have in the US, prohibiting discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities because they would have a disability in public service, employment, public accommodations. There's also something called Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and that further ensures that federally funded programs and activities are accessible. And then globally, there are laws all over the world, but just to call out a few, there's frameworks like the UK's Equality Act or the UN's Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that play similar roles, underscoring the universal need for equity. There's different levels of advancement and legal protections in different places within the world, but in general, this is a global issue that is embraced across the world. Now, in many of these laws, employers have clear responsibilities, including providing reasonable accommodations, ensuring that there's non-discrimination in hiring and workplace practices, and of course, maintaining accessibility across their operations. So neglecting these responsibilities can lead to a lot of unwanted consequences. So of course, if there are laws protecting people against these things in your area, one of those unwanted consequences could be lawsuits or significant fines, reputational damage with your constituencies, your customers, your clients, and of course, a loss of trust in general from employees or, again, customers and the public. But more than that, more than those unwanted consequences, organizations also risk alienating their stakeholders and other people like their customers who increasingly value the representation and inclusion of disabled individuals. There's a lot of information that tells us customers particularly prefer companies that hire people with disabilities. Moreover, failing to embrace disability inclusion as a key component of diversity means you're missing out on exceptional talent. And with that, the diversity of thought and the innovation that comes from having diverse perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences in your workforce. So compliance with these laws that I talked about is necessary, but it's not a ceiling, it's a floor, right? It's the baseline for what organizations should aim to achieve. And that leads me to something really important. While the legal framework set minimum standards for compliance, the ethical dimension of disability inclusion requires organizations to go further. Ethical inclusion is about recognizing the value of all employees and ensuring everyone has equitable access to opportunities by considering the myriad of differences among both disabled and non-disabled individuals. It calls us to create a culture where all people feel respected, valued, and empowered to succeed. And consider this thought. An organization might technically comply in the US, for example, with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, by installing ramps and accessible bathrooms. So they address the physical barriers that people would have encountered. But if that same company's hiring practices or communication styles or workplace culture in general unintentionally excludes disabled individuals or makes working there more difficult for us, that same company that made those changes to be more accessible is falling short ethically, right? So true inclusion requires empathy-driven action and intentional practices that extend beyond the bare minimum. Some other examples of ethical failures despite being compliant is a workplace that meets those physical accessibility standards but fails to provide meaningful accommodations for neurodivergent employees, or an organization that hired disabled individuals but fails to create pathways for growth or advancement. Many people that I know who have disabilities have shared with me their difficulty accessing advancement opportunities. So the ethical imperative here is to bridge the gap between and compliant behavior, compliant action, and also cultivating meaningful inclusion, creating an environment where disabled individuals not only belong, but can thrive in their roles. Now, there are some practical steps that you can take to align the legal and ethical goals of your organization to bridge that gap. So let's talk about three key areas to create a truly supportive workplace. The first is accommodations as a standard practice. Normalizing the accommodation process is key. This means making it transparent and accessible so that employees feel comfortable requesting the tools and resources they need to succeed. Too often, people hesitate to ask for accommodations because we fear judgment or stigma. By simplifying the process and ensuring it's communicated clearly across the organization, you can break down this barrier. Managers play a crucial, pivotal role in this. Training managers to respond empathetically to accommodations requests is essential. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard stories about managers who have not responded appropriately to a request for accommodations. When managers show understanding and support, it helps foster that trust. It enables employees to work at their full potential, makes us feel like we have a space in the organization, we're valued and appreciated. Imagine a company that provides noise canceling headphones for employees with sensory sensitivities. It's a simple but impactful way to meet individual needs and enhance productivity. It's not just about meeting the legal requirement. Again, we should be creating a workplace where employees feel valued and supported. The next step that you can take is nurturing a truly inclusive workplace culture. Inclusion isn't something that happens automatically. It requires intentional effort and regular training. Conducting sessions on unconscious bias and disability etiquette helps shift mindsets and equips your team to be more welcoming and understanding. Another way to promote inclusion is by encouraging employees to embrace the diverse perspectives represented in your organization. For instance, I see a lot of companies and our clients celebrating different disability awareness months throughout the year, and that can be an excellent opportunity to engage your workforce. Hosting an employee storytelling session or panel discussions gives people a platform to share their experiences and helps build a stronger, more connected community within your organization. So the goal here is to go beyond policy and create a culture where inclusion is embedded just in everyday interactions and organizational values. And the last step I'll suggest today is measuring and improving your inclusion efforts. How do you know if your initiatives are working? You got to start by gathering feedback, employee surveys, voluntary focus groups. These are really valuable tools for understanding what's effective and where improvements are needed. It's also important to track data on accommodation requests, on hiring, and disclosures typically are what we look for in the hiring process, because that's usually the only way we know it's connected to disability. So disability disclosure data is key. And something that is crucial but isn't tracked as often and should be is the promotions of disabled employees who have self-identified. So this data provides insight into the success of your programs. It highlights areas where more work might be needed. Some organizations use technology with different dashboards to monitor their progress on inclusion goals. And these dashboards can keep everyone accountable and ensure that inclusion remains a priority and it's got visibility. So embedding these steps into your organizational practices is going to ensure a holistic approach to inclusion that goes beyond simply meeting that legal obligation. It aligns with the ethical aspirations to create a workplace where everyone, disabled and non-disabled, neurodivergent and neurotypical alike, can thrive. So small incremental steps can lead to long-term sustainable growth. So if something I've mentioned is beyond your reach right now, don't let that stop you from taking steps, right? By taking any of these actions, or even going in the direction of these actions, you are making small incremental progress toward important change that's going to foster greater trust with your workforce and your talent communities and your customers and other stakeholders. It's going to promote innovation and it's going to nurture a culture of belonging. So I encourage you to start bridging that gap. And speaking of bridging the gap, moving beyond compliance and you know taking that step to embrace the ethical dimensions of disability inclusion is going to have transformational effects on your workplace culture. What I see in the role that I have, providing training and consultative support, is that organizations that listen to employee feedback and commit to embedding disability inclusion into their core values often experience three things commonly. One is increased employee retention and engagement. Another is enhanced innovation that's driven by those perspectives I talked about. And then the last thing I see often is greater trust and recognition from employees, from customers, and from stakeholders. So the intersection of legal compliance and ethical inclusion is about aligning policies with people's lived experiences. So by going beyond the minimum requirements, you can not only meet expectations, but exceed them, setting a new standard for inclusion and representation. So just to highlight some of the key takeaways I've talked about, again, legal frameworks like the ADA are essential, but they are the floor, not the ceiling of what's possible in disability inclusion. Ethical inclusion goes beyond compliance, focusing on empathy, respect, creating equitable opportunities for all employees. And then lastly, some practical steps we talked about, such as improving the accommodation process and prioritizing it, fostering an inclusive culture across your organization, putting disability inclusion as a part of that daily interaction. And then, of course, measuring your progress, ensuring that your organization aligns legal obligations with ethical aspirations. Now, as we wrap up today's episode, I encourage you to think about how your organization approaches disability inclusion and ask some questions. Are you simply meeting legal requirements, or are you embedding inclusion into your culture and practices? Is this something you're interested in? If you'd like guidance on bridging the gap between compliance and culture, we'd love to connect. At Rangam, through our EmpathyLearns products and services, we offer training and consulting solutions to help organizations navigate those difficult disability inclusion challenges. So feel free to reach out to discuss how we can support your journey. As always, thank you for joining us today. We'll be sending out a survey shortly after the webinar to gather your feedback and learn how we can improve and support your inclusion efforts further. So I look forward to seeing your feedback, and I look forward to seeing you in episode 4. We're going to be discussing building an inclusive company culture. Together, we can create workplaces that work for everyone. Remember, the future of work is inclusive. See you next time, friends.